The Thracians would continue to dominate public life throughout antiquity. For example, apart from the well-known example of the Thracian gladiator Spartacus, many Thracians became emperors of Rome, such as Regalianus, Galerius, Maximian, Maximinus Dio, Leo I, Aurelius Valerius Valens, Licinius, Constantine the Great, Constantius III, Marcinus, Justin I, Justinian I, Justin II, Ficus, etc. Today in Eastern Europe we find that in the countries where the Thracian presence was strong the cultures are almost identical. We find the same dances, songs and clothing styles. We know from Middle Age chronicles that the European civilization was superior to the Slavic one at the time of the Great Slavic migrations, and that none of the Slavic nations that migrated to Europe during the Dark Ages have preserved their folklore and costumes. This can be easily shown by contrasting them with what we find in the places where they originally left from, in northern Russia. One last enigma about the Thracians that we need to solve is that of their language. We know that Rome was founded by Thracians who fled from Troy after the war with the Greeks. The Roman historian Titus Livius said in his work Ab Orbi Condita that Aeneid, the son-in-law of the Trojan king Priam, ran by sea from Troy after its fall, together with other Trojans, and reached the Italian peninsula and founded Rome. Troy and the entire neighboring area were Thracian. The Trojans settled in an area of the Italian peninsula that was already inhabited by Thracian tribes. For example, we know that the Etruscans, which formed the basis of the future population of the city of Rome, were Thracian people that migrated from modern Turkey according to Herodotus. Also, Hellanicus of Lesbos and Thucydides talk about the Thracians and the Etruscans as one and the same people, descendants of the Pelasgians, the ancient people that the Greeks would find when they migrated to Europe. The Veneti tribe was also a Thracian tribe according to Herodotus, Strabon, Polybius and other ancient historians. If Rome was founded by Thracians from Troy together with Thracians that already lived in the area, the logical conclusion would be that the precursor of the Latin language was the language of the Thracians. This conclusion is supported by numerous ancient accounts. For example, the Roman historian Marcus Villus Paterculus, who wrote about the Trojan War, says that in all the eastern regions a kind of, quote, Roman language is spoken. The Roman poet Horatius writes in his odes about the Dacians a century before Dacia would be conquered by the Romans, saying that they speak a language similar to Latin, probably as close as Italian and Spanish are today, given the long time period in which Eastern and Western Thracians lived separately. We get more clues about the Thracian language by studying the wars between the Dacians and the Romans. The Romans conquered only a small part of the kingdom of Dacia, and only 2 permanent legions occupied it for just 165 years. A Roman legion had roughly 5,000 people, most of whom were not Romans but were gathered from all corners of the empire. They left the army at around 45 years old and so did not have families. And yet we find the local population speaking a Latin language after the withdrawal of the Romans, including in the areas that never came into contact with the Roman administration. In other areas occupied by Romans such as Judea, Greece or Britain. This did not happen even though those regions were occupied and colonized for much longer time periods. Also, Dacia would be later occupied for more than 1,000 years together by the Austrian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, and yet the local population held on to its Latin language. This leads us to believe that the Dacians were already speaking a Latin language before they were occupied by Rome. The historian Dio Cassius says about Emperor Trajan, the one who defeated the Dacians, that he was a true Thracian and that the wars between the Dacians and the Romans were fratricide wars. He was also quoted by Chrysostomus in his accounts of the Dacian wars as saying that the Emperor Trajan said that he was, quote, returning to the country of his ancestors, when leaving for Dacia. Also, according to the Spanish historian Jesus Pardo, in the testament left to Licinius Chitus, the commander of the legion that finally conquered the Dacian capital Sarmizegetusa, Emperor Trajan says that his name comes from Tracianus, meaning from Thracia, and was born in a village of Thracian colonizers that spoke the language of the Dacians, a sister language of the Latin spoken in Rome. Linguistics gives us one last clue. The Romanians who today live on the territory of Dacia have the only language in the world that is descendant of Classical Latin. All other Latin languages are descendant of Vulgar Latin, showing that the language spoken by the early Romans was descendant of the language of the Thracians. The only other people that have a language descendant of Classical and not Vulgar Latin are the Vlachs of the Balkans, also called the Romanians, which after thousands of years of aggressive assimilation by the Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians and other Balkan nations, still speak a dialect of the language spoken in Romania today. Michael Ledwith is today the Dean of St. Peter's College in Wexford, former chairman of the Conference of Heads of Irish Universities and former member of the leadership of the European University Rectors Conference. As a former advisor to Pope John Paul II, he had access to the vast library of the Vatican that also houses ancient texts which are not available to average historians. This is what he has to say.
But anyway, even though Latin is the language of the Catholic Church and obviously the language of the Roman Empire much later, and as I suppose people don't always know, Romanian is a Latin language. I think what is not often remembered is that Romanian, or the ancestry of Romanian, is from where the Latin language came, not vice versa. In other words, Romanian is not a Latin language, rather Latin is a Romanian language.